What's good, everybody? My name is Alckemy. Welcome to the channel. Today we are going to be talking about something that I get a lot of questions over, which is why did I switch to Bitwig from Ableton? And I've answered this question in a lot of different ways, and I already have a video that's kind of covering it. Granted, I've got a little bit more experience into, well, I guess both programs because I still have to use them both for specific situations, but when it comes to expressing myself and making music, I go in favor of Bitwig, and I'm here to tell you why. That being said, towards the second part of the video, I'm also going to be explaining why I still miss Ableton and why I still have to use it for some particular things. So if that's all interesting to you, hopefully this video is for you. It could be something that could help you decide on whether or not you want to switch from either or, and if you've switched from a different DAW to a different DAW or whatever, then feel free to let me know in the comments. So before we get into all that, please do me a favor, like and subscribe to the video if you like this kind of content, and we've got a lot to talk about, so I'm going to hop in. Ableton and Bitwig by nature are very similar programs. If you look at them, it would almost look like they're just two different skins of each other minus a couple of different things. I will say that there are some key major workflow things that Bitwig has over Ableton that has been some amazing game changers for me, and I'm going to tell you about those right now. The first few things that we'll discuss are the accessibility options for creating new tracks or for pulling up your browser. There's one up already right here, which would be the same thing as this one, even though like they're on the opposite side, and you can always hide that if you want. But if I want to pull up a new device or something, I can just hit one of these plus buttons either in the device view or the track view or the inspector view. Speaking of, I didn't think that I was going to like having an inspector on Bitwig, but it has become incredibly useful, especially for the fact that I don't have to double click on a sample in order to pull up this, which there's a lot of things that you can do within this, which we'll talk about later in the video. However, having the ability to kind of just pull that up right here without having to pull this up, so I can have both that and the device menu up at the same time, has been very convenient. The second thing with this is the idea that we have what's called hybrid tracks. As you can see here, I've got both MIDI and audio on the same track that can still play through MIDI here. So if I were to pull up something like FM4, then I can technically have both audio playing and send MIDI through at the same time. And also the fact that I have MIDI through, which means over here you can see that I've got Cthulhu set up, and the way that you have to do that is you have to create a different MIDI track and then come to a new MIDI channel and take the MIDI data from a different channel is kind of cumbersome. And instead of doing all that, I can just come over here, add a plus button, type in that device, and it'll just work. That makes things very easy for me if I ever want to use stuff like that. It's not the most useful in this particular situation, but if you're using something like attaching a vocoder to another synth, so for example, if I go here and I add in something like phase plant in this instead of just brown noise, and then I start to pull up different patches from phase plant and use that as a carrier, that makes things pretty convenient and pretty interesting, and it's just, you know, another one of those quality of life things that make it really fun to do. Yeah, you can definitely use an external modulator, and you can do that through Ableton as well through having an external carrier, but the convenience factor is that it's all on the same track. So the next thing that has been arguably the biggest for me is the fact that everything can be modulated. And so if you hit this little plus button right here, this will pull up your entire list of modulators, which granted, I pretty much only use this one. But even still, having the ability to randomize just about every parameter that not only first-party plugins, but also third-party plugins can do has been an immense game changer for the way that I do sound design and also the way that I create music in general, especially if you have mud pies. Let's go ahead and get the elephant out of the room. You can see here that there is no MSEG, and I don't know why. I don't know why there is no MSEG, which if you look right here, you can see that Ableton does have one. And for me personally, I would think that that was a big deal, but it turns out that I actually like doing the randomization better. But even still, I know that's a feature that a lot of people want. It's just kind of baffling that this doesn't really have it. This doesn't count, the 4-shaper. So aside from that though, you can see here that the interface behind this is very convenient. All of these devices have this little key function right here, and you can hide them and make that very clean to kind of see what you're doing. With this, if you double click, it will, make it shorter, but if you've got a bunch of different modulators and stuff that are all kind of, stacking up on your effects chains and your device menu, then sometimes that's just not quite as clean. And it's not to say that that's bad, but it just, again, that's just a preference that I have to, prefer this over that. Generally speaking, I also think that this is a much easier program on the eyes, and I kind of like how everything just kind of has a little bit of a shine to it. There's not as many colors in Bitwig as there are in Ableton. You can see here that the color palette is probably twice as many, but at the same time, they do have that just kind of nice pop to it and saturation and stuff that looks really good to look at. Let's go ahead and move on. If we look over here, then we have a couple of features that make this a lot better than Ableton in regards to bouncing in place as compared to freezing and flattening. So with this, all I have to do if I want to bounce in place is just hit Command B, which is a custom keyboard shortcut that I set up, but it makes it incredibly easy because if I go over this way and just do this, and I don't have to freeze or flatten anything else. So that means that I can keep working on this patch and just have this cool little moment of sound, set up right there, and then I can kind of keep working on that with the hybrid tracks. So, and not just that, but if I have some kind of chord progression or whatever, then I can kind of bounce the second one together in order to make a variation to it, and that's something that is incredibly useful. I think that with Ableton's freezing and flattening for its time, it was actually really good because it allowed you to freeze the track and save a lot of CPU, but the problem with it was that you couldn't change it once it was frozen, and with this you can just turn everything off or do that bounce in place, or you can also hit J and resample to a new track and it will already work. But the cool thing about that, again, like I said before, is because we're in hybrid tracks, I can continue to send MIDI through this or make changes to absolutely everything that I want to. And that's a huge convenience factor, again, for me. Moving on, especially with the idea of working within audio, you can feel free to disagree with me, but Bitwig has the best audio editor out there in any DAW. And I'm going to show you why right now. For one, we have something in here called a clip, and then we also have an audio event. And with these audio events, what you're allowed to do is to come in here and manipulate each of these independently, meaning that you can change the warping, that you can change the pitch, you can change the timing, whatever, you can scrub through the sample, but you're working within the clip itself. So you can see here that I've made a little cut right here. It's kind of hard to tell, but if I were to pull this over, then you can see that everything is working all within this. But the crazy thing about this is that even though we are in the same clip, let's say I wanted to stretch this section out just like that, and then for this in particular, I want to chop this into, just these little pieces here and stutter that, and then I want to highlight all of these, which you can't do in Ableton, and add fades to them, or maybe with this one I want to come in here and change the pitch, or do formant shaping. This is absolutely insane. Not to mention the fact that these all come with operators, which you can do both in audio and MIDI, which if I want to do some kind of exponential rhythm, which is really the only thing that I ever use this for, but I can kind of set these all to just make absolutely crazy sounds. This is probably just going to sound like a buzzing, but even still, the ability to kind of work within that is absolutely awesome, and I just don't think that there's anything else in the market right now that parallels that. In regards to Ableton, there's a couple of key things that I think they could do to really help shape this. And so if you have some kind of sample or whatever, for example, let's just pull this one here. The problem that I have with this is that you can only edit these samples on an individual basis. So if I highlight them all and then try to shape that, it only grabs this one. Why does it do that? If I were to right click this and do something else that Ableton can't do, which is slice in place, and do something like 1/8 notes, okay, well this just sliced that for me, thank you Bitwig. And if I highlight all of these, then I can do all of the same processing, fades, whatever, to every single clip. And I just don't get why that's not a feature within something that's so powerful as an Ableton. So in that regards, there's more information that I have, because I can spend a lifetime talking about the workflow of audio editing and stuff in Bitwig, but I have more information on that in some other videos, which I'll link in the cards. Let's go ahead and move on though. So speaking of audio, one major component to this is that I don't have to worry about ASD files. Whenever you create a new project in Ableton, in order for Ableton to remember where the samples are placed. They create these like temporary ASD files, and it just drives me crazy because it always makes it seem like you have a duplicate of your sample. And if you delete that ASD file and you pull that project back up, it's going to say that the file is missing, and that drives me absolutely insane. It is such a nightmare. I really, yeah. So with Bitwig, I don't actually have to have that problem. And even though it's not perfect and sometimes this forgets the sample location and stuff itself, it's got a really easy search function over here where you can just go in and say find all or collect and save, which I know that Ableton has a collect and save as well. But even still, I don't run into that issue nearly as much, and on top of that, I don't ever have to have that ASD file regardless of if it loses the file or not. I know that I talked about the colors and stuff and about how I prefer this interface, but the other thing that might be useful to you is the fact that both your clip launcher, or session view rather, and your timeline are both in a single tab, whereas over here you can only flip in between each one. And that might be better for you actually. You might be like, man, I don't really want to look at the timeline right now. I just kind of want to focus on launching clips and stuff. But I feel like once you get to the recording stage of all this and you've got your loops triggered and XYZ and whatnot, you kind of want to see what's happening on your timeline to make sure that everything is lining up. And with this, it's kind of nice to be able to just, you know, do both of them simultaneously without having to worry about losing track of something. The other thing that's really useful that I explained in one of my first Bitwig videos is that you can actually use this as a bank for new resamples that you make. So let's say you don't want this on the timeline, but you don't want to lose that clip in particular. Well, you can take this and just kind of place it over here and then delete this off of the timeline, and now you've got this kind of sample in your pocket, or, you know, sample bank or whatever, to when it's ready you can just drag it back out and then, you know, start using that as a rearranger. It's kind of like a different workaround towards that, and not really what it was necessarily quote-unquote intended for, but I still think that this is something that is very useful if you like to kind of have like a, you're like making your own sample pack right here, even though it's kind of spread out and can get somewhat chaotic, but you're essentially doing just that. Or like maybe you take a sound design jam, you've got a mud pie or something, and then you kind of just have it over here. You can double click right there, start to do like your cutting, pick out the best parts or whatever, and then, you know, the organization aspect of that is just way more simple for me in particular. So the next thing is probably why I would argue that Bitwig is the easiest DAW to learn. So if you look over here, then you can see that if you highlight over something, there's the info view on the left, which will give you a short description about what things do. I think that Bitwig took that a step further by clicking on this and going into the show help view over here, which pulls up a complete view of the device itself that is actually interactive, that you can actually use. This isn't probably the best example, but you can see here that you can actually start to apply things and make changes and whatnot in order to kind of figure out what it is that you're doing. And this is one of the most important things for new people to kind of come into, because it says, hey, this is this container, this is what it looks like, this is what this knob does, and it points directly to it, as opposed to this just kind of being like, well, what is this in general and what is it doing? It's like a built-in manual, and it makes it so much more, again, convenient for you to RTFM. The last thing that I do want to cover is the sampler. Gosh, the sampler is amazing, and I think that the sampler in Ableton is also really good, and they both have really strong points that stand on their own. But the sampler in Bitwig in particular, for me, is a huge game changer, and I'm going to tell you why. The fact that you have a built-in granular synth is kind of already like the money right there. The fact that you can warp or cycle between these sample modes, like on the fly with a modulator, is really cool. I will say that you have to trigger a new MIDI note in order for it to change, but if you want something to play normal and then go into a texture aspect, you can get some really freaking insane stuff out of that. One thing that's really cool is if you look right here, you can see that a select knob is already built in, and that means that if you create some kind of multi-sample or whatever, then you can right click and then go to distribute whatever it is that you want to do. Let's go select evenly, and now I can kind of use this in order to be able to select between these parameters. Which is, again, super convenient. We've got these other things too that I'm not going to go too far into, with zone parameters and all that you can set up with, you know, different groups within this. But the killer feature behind this is if you hit undo and you have all of these playing at once, you can have up to 128 different samples all being played through granular mode. And you get some insane soundscapes. In fact, all of those sounds that I've made through Ash in general, and that's just a couple of them, but those were all made through Sampler in general, and that's just freaking amazing. This does come with a drawback, which I'll talk about in something that I miss with Ableton, but let's just kind of put that in our pockets for now. So in essence, like, I think that those workflow features kind of stood out enough for me to want to be able to make that switch. And it's, again, just a convenience factor that really caters towards the way that I like to make music. I didn't mention the grid, and I didn't mention a couple of other things. I'm not here to give you a full feature list about why you should switch, because that's, again, going to become a really long video. But with all that being said, those reasons are particularly why I find Bitwig to be so much more useful than Ableton. It really feels like a graduation, as opposed to like something that's either completely different or something that's, you know, it's almost there but not quite, which Bitwig took a really long time to get there. Within Ableton though, there are some things that I still miss, and it's not to say that it's enough to make me hold back, but these are features that I hope for Bitwig to adopt, at least some of them in that aspect, in order to be able to kind of, you know, fill the void, if you will. Again, if I haven't said it enough, Ableton is great, and the stuff that it can do is very strong. It's just that it's not as convenient anymore to do it as it is in Bitwig. So let's go ahead and talk about some of those features that I miss from Ableton, and hopefully by the end you'll kind of have your information that you need on whether or not you either want to make the switch to either or whether or not my choice of the new journey is justified. So the biggest thing that I miss from Ableton, honestly, is the effects and the instruments. Bitwig just is not up to par on most effects. Now I will say that there's a couple of them that are very unique and that work incredibly well. For example, the transient shaper in Bitwig is just amazing. The drum bus is also really good in Ableton, it's just not quite as versatile. But specific things like the corpus, the tube distortion or the dynamic tube, the multiband dynamics, not for OTT just because I like the multiband dynamics anyways, and then some of actual Live 11's new stuff, which I don't own, but the hybrid reverb or the convolution reverb is really amazing. Operator is awesome. And probably the biggest one for me is Simpler, and this is the one thing that I am missing as a kind of like sampler or something from Bitwig. So the thing that's so cool about Simpler mode is that it also has these different ways that you can kind of do all these as well, but they're different than Bitwig's sampler, for one, but two, this one in particular is the one that I miss the most, especially when I'm talking about chopping long sections of audio and all that. With this in particular, you can have a bunch of different slice modes that you can like find on the fly without having to redo everything. And not only that, but you can change the warp modes between these to something like Texture or Complex Pro and really kind of drag those out and create like really interesting stuff in order to do that. This is an essential tool for IDM for me. And the way that you have to do that in Bitwig is to highlight your thing and then go right click and go to slice to multi-sample. And I don't like doing that because it commits the slices. And if I want to refine new slices or whatever, I have to go a couple steps back and then try to find new slices, and that's just not very convenient. The multi-sample thing is really cool for like creating instruments and stuff, but I think that having something like this where it will just automatically find different cuts for you that's so difficult to beat. The next thing that I want to talk about with Ableton is that even though I don't have the convenience factor where I have to double click and kind of come into all this stuff, is that if you set this to some particular warp modes, like this is kind of like just like a personal taste thing, but I think that the warp modes in Ableton still just resonate with me better. And I don't want to say that they're better, because I don't think that's the right way to describe it. I think that it's just some things I'm more used to working with. Like, so for example, one thing that I really miss is that in repitch mode, if you transposition something down, it will actually stretch the sample out. Whereas in here, if you go to repitch mode, you can still do that, but it changes. So you have to go here, and then instead you have to change the tempo as opposed to being able to just like transpose. And that's not quite as intuitive. And I guess you can do math of being like, oh, well, the original tempo was in this, and then so you double that or whatever, and then there's an octave, but everything in between is just kind of not as easy to do. That being said, there's plenty of different things that you can do to manipulate pitch within this that are just as interesting. It's just different, and it's something that I still want to see this kind of include in that way. So the next big thing that's really important to me is actually the MIDI capture note, which was introduced in Live 10. And I think that for somebody that likes to write musical stuff, this is one of the most essential tools that I don't know of any other DAW that actually has this. But if you playing or jamming and you don't have the record button on, then a lot of times you're like, oh man, I wish that I would have just played that or whatever. Whereas with this, you can just, oh man, that riff was it. That was the thing. And then you can just hit that capture button and boom, there it is. And so you never have to worry about losing that idea. And I think that aside from Bitwig, like every other DAW should have something like this, to which that's one thing. I don't really work in MIDI anymore in that aspect. I don't really even make like musical music anymore. It's more texture based and stuff. But I think that if I had the ability to do this, then it would make my life a lot easier and make me want to come back to that kind of stuff a lot more. But this tool was so useful to me that I think that it's something that everybody can use, even if it's not even music. It could be beats, or it could be just, anything. That like pre-record capture thing, I think should be just like the almost like universal thing that, yeah, that's a big game changer for just about everybody. I never really had the chance to get into Max for Live. I guess it's not even that I didn't really have the chance, I never really got to it and I didn't really understand it, but that's why I didn't really want to compare the grid to this in particular, because I don't really use the grid either. But I think that Max for Live is definitely something that's slept on in the aspect that you can pretty much make, well, just about anything. And you might argue that you can do that in Reactor, you might argue that you can do that technically in the grid, but the difference between Max and the grid, well, one difference rather, because there's a lot, is that you can make specific interfaces that are built for Ableton and pretty much make your own facets of things to kind of cater towards how you want Bitwig to run or how you want that to go. And it's nice to have the option. The learning curve is absolutely astronomical, but I think that if the grid in Bitwig were able to somehow to allow you to, shape the interfaces and stuff, which I don't think it was designed for that or whatever, then that would be something that would maybe turn me more onto that, of like building those custom things. But every patch kind of just looks like a bunch of wires and all that under the hood, and you have to kind of learn that atmosphere. Whereas with Max for Live devices, it's just a lot easier to set up. It goes beyond just macros, right? There's actual like fully integrative things that you can do. For example, Grain Spec from Wolg, which is a great plugin, is a awesome tool that he developed through Max for Live in that way. And while there are, some great Hocket machines and stuff, again, that you can do within the grid, and don't get me wrong, like having the ability to do like granular synthesis and stuff, and that is really great too. It's just something that it does make me not necessarily regret, but it does make me kind of wish that I went back and spent a little bit more time on that to learn that. Because there are some people out there that are like, I will not switch from Ableton because Max for Live is too essential to me, and that's a valid reason. So the other stuff isn't necessarily that important. I don't really do a whole lot of automation anymore other than basic shapes and stuff, but if you click right here, they don't really have any kind of like integrative things, whereas if you go into the automation lanes over here and you highlight a specific piece, you can right click and insert shapes, and you can also resize the windows and do like cool things like that. And I think that like if automation is your thing, this is probably where you want to be. If you want randomization, this is where you want to be. That's just kind of it. I don't really do like lots of crazy automations with bass and stuff anymore, because even though it is more precise, it just takes too much time, and I would much rather try to set something really cool up and get more out of it and leave things to chance and try to time them, as opposed to sitting here and fiddling with nodes and stuff in that way. It's not a huge game changer for me, but maybe it is for you, and it's important to kind of discuss those things and have those comparisons, right? The next thing is that while I do love the interface within Bitwig a lot more than Ableton does have like custom skins, and while I think that they all still look like Excel sheets, you can only really change like the main color of Bitwig, which is either gray, or pulling all the contrast and saturation back and going into black, which black is great and I love that, but I don't really like the orange atmosphere of that stuff. If this were the other color, like that red color that some of Bitwig's stuff has been in the past, I think that would be really cool. But man, even if I could just change this button, like, you know, these things that kind of lay out in that aspect of like blue or purple or, you know, something different, that would go a really long way for me. It's not that big of a deal, but again, you know, that's just one of those things. Or you could be like FL Studio and have, you know, whatever the heck you want, and to the point that it doesn't even look like FL Studio anymore, but that's just kind of a small thing. A couple other small things that may or may not be useful to you is that Bitwig recently introduced comping. Like, well, I guess it made comping easier. It always had comping via highlighting multiple clips and then going into multi-layer view. But then it introduced like actual comping to where, like, you know, you can do it that way. But the problem with this comparison is that while Ableton Live 11 has comping with both MIDI and audio, Bitwig only has comping with audio. And I'm not sure if they have that planned for a future update or so, but it's just kind of one of those like weird omissions that's like, oh, okay, well, that's not there. I don't use comping in particular. You might. That's just one thing that, you know, you might kind of want to be aware of. And then since we're talking about like updates and stuff, which I don't want to get too far into, there's also scale modes in Ableton Live as well, which may or may not be useful to you. I don't really use those, and there's different like scale modulators and stuff that you can do to find that. They're not as integrative as something like with the push or whatever, but I only use the push for a finite amount of time, and I like the scales and stuff better within Bitwig anyways. But, you know, it's sometimes really convenient to just, you know, double click on this. I have Ableton 10, so I can't pull it up, but to just pull this up and then be like, oh, I want to just write or like forge all the MIDI into being, you know, F minor, because that's what everybody writes in. And then there's that aspect. But probably the primary reason why I still have to keep Ableton is for the simple fact that Ableton has video editing, or you can edit audio from video import, if you will, something like that. If I go in here and I import, you know, some kind of video of some aspect, you guys will already know I'm not really going to do that, but I can pull up a video and then edit this together and then even export that, whereas this does not support video at all whatsoever. There is a workaround, which is a VST, which is like 20 bucks, and I'll put a link in the description of where to find that. And I haven't downloaded it yet. It's on my to-do list, but it is supposedly working. Along with, there is a glue compressor from Cytomic, which I went and bought, which was another 100 bucks or whatever, of Cytomic's The Glue. So the glue on Cytomic is exactly the same as the glue compressor here, minus the fact that this has more makeup gain. So this goes from soft clipping, and then once it reaches here, it will go into hard clipping. Whereas with the glue compressor here, it has soft clipping, but you can only push the gain to 20 dB, as you can see. So there is that, but they're made by the same dude. Look, it says Cytomic. And that's important to note, but that is an extra expense for something that I've deemed to be like, that was one thing that I could not leave from Ableton. I rely on that heavy compression so much within a lot of my music that, yeah, I don't know. There's other cheaper options, they just don't work as well. And it's really just the algorithm that Cytomic uses that I needed to keep in that way, which is another thing. Like, for someone like Ableton, I really hope that down the line they really think about releasing some of their effects and instruments as third-party VSTs, because I would hop right on buying Simpler. I would actually probably buy their tube distortion as well. It sounds really good. So yeah, those are my biggest reasons why I like Bitwig. If you guys have your own reasons why you guys like Bitwig, or you have your own reasons why you still prefer Ableton, I would love to know, as long as we keep the discussion healthy. This is not meant to say this is better than the other or whatever. This is not necessarily like the end-all be-all comparison video, because that would just take too long. Baphometrics did that a while ago, granted with an older version that you can still watch. I'm not here to do that. I'm just here to tell you, like, hey, this is the stuff that I really dig about this program, and that's why it motivated me enough to switch over, and I don't regret it. There's some things that I miss, for sure, which I think that if you use a different program than you're used to, then you're always going to have something that you miss. But as similar as these are, Bitwig's workflow, in my opinion, has been improved on in so many different ways, except for maybe minus the automation and the MIDI editing. If that's your, that's your jam, then maybe you should consider staying. But for me in particular, I was like, dude, I love this. I love the hybrid tracks and the modulators and all that stuff. So if you have made it to the end of this video, thank you so much. Please consider liking and subscribing. If you guys have any other questions regarding these two programs, I've been using them for a very long time, and I'm still, learning the ins and outs of them both, but I do know them pretty well. So, let me know in the comments. Thank you guys. I will see you in the next one.